Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. We're excited to announce that registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA is officially open. Beginning September 30th, 2025, this 9-month facilitated learning journey was created for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with over 500 different social enterprises, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy and dive into key business principles from a regenerative and equity-centered lens, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement to create a world that works for all of us. Interested in learning more? Join us for a free intro session where you can meet course facilitators and hear from alumni to determine if the program's a fit for you. Plus, you can save 20% on tuition when you register before August 11th during our early bird sale. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening. And now, onto the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined today by my fellow partner, Kevin Bayuk, also partner, worker owner, co-founder at Lyft. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well. Thank you, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing good. We were chatting before we started recording that Next Economy Now, this podcast, is almost 10 years old. It's 10 years old this year. Our first episode was November 2015. And I remember the original intention of this was me and you and some of the other Lyft partners talking about things that we thought were pretty cool that we didn't hear other places, like what is the next economy? What is worker ownership? What is values-based invoicing? Those were, I think, our first 3 episodes. And yeah, it's been a wild ride. I remember we recorded on Google Meet or something like that. No, there's probably Google Hangouts back then. And I don't know if the technology has changed much, but we want to express gratitude to everyone listening because it's been a wild ride. When we started, there was 400,000 podcasts, and now there's like 4.5 million podcasts. So there's a lot more competition, but there's also a lot of bad podcasts, and half of those are not active podcasts. So we're still active, baby, even though there was like a gap in COVID and 1 or 2 other spots. Kevin, any reflections on the 10-year journey?
Yeah, one of my favorite things is to be having a conversation with somebody at a conference or not at a conference and something totally unrelated to the work that we do and have them say, "Oh, you're involved in Next Economy Now? I listened to the episode where you interviewed such and such," or "I always listen to that," and they'll share some details about what they like about it. And it reminds me that there is value in sharing these stories that are not often available or accessible through any mainstream media or other media outlets, and that we're still contributing to the life and knowledge and learning and making sense of the world for people who listen to podcasts. And confession I know you know this, Ryan, but like when we started Next Economy Now as a podcast, I didn't listen to podcasts. I didn't find that in my, behavior pattern to find a time. I've since moved around in my life and I have a habit or pattern of being able to listen to some podcasts. So it's very choicefully picking through some things, but I definitely have more sympathies and empathy for people who find this as a great way to access information that they otherwise wouldn't find ways to access.
Yeah. Have you ever listened to a podcast while showering? That's the true test if you're a podcast listener.
I have not done that yet. I feel like I'd make it for a long shower. I want to keep my showers short.
That's right. I've been like, I don't have any other time to fit this podcast in. So while I'm showering, I'm just going to listen. That's the true test. Okay. Quickly, what was one of your favorite episodes looking back of all time to conduct? And then what about a favorite one that you listened to, maybe conducted by another Lyft team member?
One of my favorite ones to conduct was with David Holmgren, one of my teachers and the co-originator of the term permaculture. And that was a great privilege and honor to interview or speak with one of my teachers. And I found it to be as enlightening as ever and super enjoyable, and something that I never thought I would be able to do or have a venue for that type of opportunity. And in terms of ones that our team has done so many amazing interviews over time with amazing thought leaders. One of my favorite people in the Next Economy who has a lot of insight and stories, I believe Aaron on our team interviewed Janelle Orsi. Maybe you did too, but Ryan, maybe back in the day, we might have had Janelle on more than once. But Janelle, one of the co-founders of the Sustainable Economies Law Center, I always learn so much from Janelle and become greatly inspired whenever I hear her thoughts.
Yeah.
How about you?
For me,
any? Yeah.
I think there's a couple that stand out. One was Rose Marcario, CEO of Patagonia, just because it was one of those things where we've joked. We'll tell the story about Expo West in a minute here, but I think Rose was amazing because why would the CEO of Patagonia talk to me otherwise if it wasn't for a podcast? So that was one. And then I think two more recent ones were Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, Internal Family Systems. He actually did a session with me live on the podcast, which was pretty cool. And then Thomas Hubel, I've known about for many years through my brother. My brother's been involved in his community. So getting to speak with some of those folks was pretty amazing. And then listen to, gosh, there's been so many. I remember Sean had done some with, I think it was an Indigenous activist. I think it was like Rebecca Adamson, or does that sound familiar?
Yeah, he definitely did.
I remember that one. That was a great episode.
Yeah.
And I think he did one also with Raw Goddess. I think Move the Crowd. That was great. So there's a couple ones that stand out. And the joke that I was mentioning about Expo West, Kevin and I have gone to Expo West as a big conference, natural products conference. And we joke that if you have a podcast, people will talk to you at Expo West. If you're a consultant, no one wants to talk to you, but if you have a podcast. So one story was we wanted to talk to the CEO of Organic Valley. At the time was George Simeon. I think he was the co-founder as well. And there was this huge line of people waiting to talk to him. And we went up there and they were like, "Oh, you want to get in line to talk to George?" And we were like, "Yeah, we have a podcast. We want to interview him." They're like, "Oh, well, you have a podcast? Well, excuse us." And so they took us to the very front of the line, and George had to like cut off a conversation with someone else he was speaking with. And we were like kind of embarrassed, but also like, wow, this thing has power. I don't know.
I was super embarrassed.
Yeah.
And grateful to meet George. What an amazing person.
Yeah. Well, I think for today, Kevin and I are going to talk about the Lyft vision articulation, but in particular, we're going to get into the hypotheses about how to bring about the next economy and how we're trying to do it at Lyft. And hopefully it could be of value to others. Kevin, do you want to set up why you think this might be interesting or valuable to listeners, and then maybe just like an overview of the topic?
Totally. When I meet somebody and they say, "What is Lyft economy?" I oftentimes will say something short and brief to learn more about their context so that I might be able to share more insights of how they might understand Lyft within their interest areas or sphere of influence. I might say something like Lyft economy is a worker-owned impact consultancy, with a mission to transform the very nature of the business as usual global economy to an economy that works for the benefit of all life. And when I say that, I can say it quickly. I usually follow it up by saying, obviously, that's something that's larger than ourselves and likely a multi-generational endeavor, at the very least, so they recognize I'm not some type of hyperbolic egoist or with some kind of inflationary vision or of our own self-importance. But I sincerely also want to convey that we're working on something that's larger than ourselves, and it's a big transition and transformation. And I rarely have time to find that contextual conversation where we can go a little bit deeper of like, well, what does it mean to transform the very nature of the business as usual economy to one that works for the benefit of all life? And how do you work on that? That's usually the context part that I usually try and circumscribe to something that's relevant to their work or their life. But in the most general sense, we have thought a lot about that at Lyft. It animates our work of what would it mean to transition or transform the economy. Whereas we don't know how it happens, we do have a theory or a series of hypotheses that we use to guide our activities. And it's a series of hypotheses that we try and update regularly, but it definitely informs the different aspects of our work, like this podcast, for example. The things that we do and how we apply our energy, our life energy to that mission or to that work, to that vision of an economy, a world that works for everyone with no one left out, that it's not arbitrary how we do our work. It is held together by a theory. And I'm not saying that theory is right, but it's a theory. And I thought maybe Next Economy Now might be a place where we can actually do some explication or exposition as to like, what is that theory of change and what are those hypotheses?
And why would that be interesting to other people?
On the one hand, it might help them reflect on their own theory. When I meet some people, they usually are, again, depending on the context, there's usually an alignment of like, yes, I do want to imagine some type of way in which humans could meet their needs reliably, food, water, shelter, the things we need to thrive as humans, and have those needs be met in such a way that it actually enhances, restores, regenerates, or heals the environment that surrounds them and within which they live. I meet a lot of people who want that, but then in terms of like, how do we get there from here? There's usually a pretty significant poverty of ideas about how that transition or transformation might occur over different time horizons. So by sharing our hypotheses, it might help somebody think like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or that makes sense. That helps me make sense not only of Lyft's activities, but I could see that hypothesis and the various strategies in alignment with that hypothesis shared amongst other organizations that I know of. And here's an honest answer, Ryan. Like, I hope that some listener listening to us explicate our theory of change and our hypotheses listens and says, oh my gosh, Lyft Economy, you've totally missed a core element of the hypotheses, or like, you're off the mark on this. I disagree entirely, and constructively would love to advocate that you develop a better map for understanding and making sense of this aspect of what needs to happen. And that might encourage us to update our model and our hypotheses, our theory, and make changes in our activities. So that's maybe the moonshot part, is like somebody actually feeds back, or maybe you as a listener say, oh gosh, Kevin, Ryan, Lyft team, you're totally missing these areas. Other than that, I hope it's at least interesting and informative of like, oh, here's a group that's dedicated to that transition or transformation, a group of humans, and this is how they make sense of it, and this is what they've thought of, and like, wow, that's just more to help them maybe inform their own map or their own theory. Yeah, or maybe we inspire somebody. That could be another outcome.
Yeah. We've got, put this in the context we're living in, at least politically in the US, we've got Trump 2, we've got Doge, we've got climate crisis, we've got species extinction, we've got, pulling away from ESG and DEI. And so it's easy to be feeling hopeless and caught in, I think, a lot of this negative situation we're in. And so maybe for the listeners, how would you tie in what we're going to talk about, these hypotheses, to, how would it be relevant to somebody who's sort of grappling with all these bigger components that are going on?
Well, there's the few things that might help with relevance. And even hearing you ask that question, Ryan, makes me think that there might be a preliminary or preface kind of conversation about how we think about transformation over time. And there's a few different models and frameworks that I'm sure listeners have heard us talk about or are familiar with. Things like the two curves or two loops model for systems change from the Berkana Institute. Meg Wheatley and Deborah Fries have inspired us greatly by sharing that. Donella Meadows' kind of levers of change comes to mind as a model or framework that we might talk about. Or recently, and I'm not sure who to credit for these frameworks, but I've heard people talk about kind of the Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, which may actually have been derived from a McKinsey thing. I'm not entirely sure. But just demonstrating that there's different streams of activity over different time horizons, so that imply different types of activities and outcomes. I've also seen what I think of like as semi-adjacent or parallel development. Some people talk about the distinctions between triage and transition and transformation, or 3Ts. And again, thinking about time as an axis of change. Change happens over time in each of those models. And there's different activities that you might do. And so in the context of our global and local political or environmental or social environment, we might find ourselves drawn to some feelings of urgency of action that might be triage, like need to reduce harm now, put on the brakes. People are suffering acutely, and there's a lot of harm that seems like it's likely to continue and maybe be exacerbated. And so there might be some activities that are triage oriented or hospice or let's do it now, let's stop the bleeding. Whereas there might be some efforts that are more related to activities like, okay, well, once we stop the bleeding and things are scabbing up, that doesn't mean we've actually changed the fundamental basis. That won't lead to more wounds. And so there might be some activities that are like, how do we transition, leveraging some of the norms and resources and structures of the existing system that's broken and creating suffering? How do we begin to transition or continue to transition to something else? And then there's maybe more transformative or midwifing in the new, as the two loops model talks about, things that are more longitudinal in their impact. They might be prefigurative today. It doesn't mean there's not action happening today, but the realization of those efforts might be generations or even centuries into the future, where the level of certainty about what's going to happen starts to diminish greatly. So when somebody's reflecting on the current situation, if you're paying attention with your emotions and so forth, I imagine that there's probably a strong kind of reaction to say, how can we stop the bleeding, stop the harm? Because there's a lot of harm in the world. And so those triage actions come present for a number of people that we communicate with. And then some people recognize, yeah, well, triage, a lot of Band-Aids, that's important, but inadequate. We need to really make sure we're setting ourselves up for transitioning to something different so we don't repeat it. And so they might be thinking about the next 10 years or something like that, or some other time horizon. And then some people will be like, well, if we transition within the constraints of the existing systems, those systems are inexorably self-terminating, or a different language, the meaning like there needs to be a full composting or a transformation or essentially a death or rebirth or a midwifery of new structures, some of which might be very, very old structures and norms, and kind of a cultural transformation. And so the word transformation usually implies longer cycles. So yeah, if I were somebody listening to this and thinking about current events, it might be possible to think about, okay, with those hypotheses in mind, what actions might I take that are triage oriented? What actions might I take that are transitionary? And what actions might we take that are truly transformative? And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. One set of actions is better for the other. Each of us might be called to different actions in this moment, depending on the season of our life or our privilege and positionality or resource access or the degree of our sense making or our biophysical emotional agency level. I mean, we're just going to be called in different ways. But I find it very relieving and helpful to at least make sense of different responses on different timescales, all of which can happen now. So when I say that, it's like, it doesn't mean that we wait to do transformational work until a couple generations down the road. Transformation takes time. And so we can do things now that are, with foresight, are intended to be transformational, and we can actually both and. It doesn't mean that there aren't actions where we can't actually have a triage effect, a transition effect, and a transformational kind of prefigurative effect. All that is possible for certain projects. That's how I would respond to like somebody who's thinking about current events.
Can I ask one other thing before we jump in? So you've been part of Project Drawdown, and there's been a lot of talk and anxiety, stress about this limiting warming to 1.5 degree Celsius. And, we're not on track to meet that, I don't think. And it seems like we're going backwards the other way. So how does one even reconcile this idea of a transformational timeline when it feels like, will there even be people, or the Earth will still be here?
Yeah.
We're not saving the planet. The planet will be okay. It will be all species and humans. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, I mean, a couple of different ways. It's like certainly the impacts of global warming and kind of the downstream second, third order, or nth order impacts of climate change are already affecting millions, maybe some would say billions of people today, maybe millions or tens of millions in acute triage for their life in terms of migration or other climate catastrophes affecting their day-to-day existence, and maybe billions in terms of the breakdown in different weather patterns due to climate change and global warming, and of course the inexorable impacts of sea level rise and so forth. The question though is like, does that mean apocalypse? One of my thinking about my permaculture teachers, Toby Hemingway, one of my teachers who I actually got to co-teach with, facilitate learning with, he wrote a great little paper that I really admired. He called it Apocalypse Not, meaning like the breakdown of civilization systems, depending on how you prognosticate. I mean, certainly there are like likely to be continued catastrophes. In the context of, I think this is an important thing to think about, is like, instead of waiting for like, wow, will there be time with the imminent impacts from global warming and climate catastrophe, climate change, I think it's helpful to, from time to time, reckon with the fact that there's already 800 million people who are hungry and malnourished today, like 900 million or a billion people without adequate water for basic sanitation or potable needs. So we're like deep in the catastrophe, like the long emergency. Some people, I forget who wrote that book, maybe Richard Heinberg or something like that. We're deep in it. And it's like thinking about the future. Will there be people? Well, there's people today, and there's likely to be humans around for quite some time. We are clever and fairly adaptive. Are there potential global catastrophic risks that could eliminate the humans? Truly existential, self-terminating in the near term? Probably. And I know there are people who study that deeply, sincerely. I think what I was referring to about Toby's paper called Apocalypse Not is a lot of the scenarios, especially related to something like climate change and climate migration and sea level rise. A lot of the impacts of that will probably play out over generations. I mean, it could be really bad with famine and horrible heat impacts and just horrible catastrophes, but the time frame under which that would lead to terminal or self-termination, I mean, the self-termination would probably come from some type of warfare, other breakdowns, other risks that are related to the crisis around climate change. But this polycrisis or whatever, the multiple crises that we live in, I don't have a good map for how those catastrophes play out over what time frame to the place where I could conclude, hey, there's no, I'm not saying you're suggesting this, Ryan, but like I can't get to a place where I conclude there's no humans. So why should we even think about this? I think it's a great thought experiment to think of a world
I
without
think
Homo
it's more
sapiens.
like, for example, 2050 is like a big
Mhm.
deadline timeline. And for me, there can be a part of me that's like, it feels like the end of the world. Like 2050 is like, there's just this cliff that like the whole
Mhm.
planet goes off of, and it's just
Yeah.
everything's done, you know,
Yeah.
in fire and brimstone or something. But obviously, I'm being a little facetious, but
Yeah. I think there are catastrophic risks where the immediacy of the existential nature of those risks is more felt. But I think things like climate change probably play out over many generations. They're already playing out. That's the gist of that apocalypse not. Also, thinking about my permaculture teachers, for whatever reason, also one kind of tiny dip into literature that I really like was David Holmgren wrote a kind of little treatise called Future Scenarios, where again prognosticating like what are the likely type scenarios for the future. And that kind of scenario thinking, there is kind of like I think he called it like Mad Max apocalypse or something like that scenario, but he kind of writes about the likelihood of those outcomes and what the mitigating factors are and the adaptive kind of approaches. And so I'm not trying to say there are no risks that exist that we shouldn't think about as being quite potentially apocalyptic and sudden. But when thinking about climate in particular, I think those are probably more multi-generational, though they could be related to other risks, if that
yeah.
makes sense.
All right, Kevin, let's turn to these hypotheses that you spoke about. Why don't we read off all of them and then we'll go into one of them because we're not going to have enough time to go into a lot. So why don't you just give folks a preview of what we will be talking about and then we'll jump into the first one.
Sounds good. So I will take one quick step back of like when people ask me about lift economy, I talk about a worker-owned impact consultancy that is working to transform the very nature of the business as usual economy to one that works for the benefit of all life. There's other parts to our mission that might be important to name. We talk about creating, modeling, and sharing a racially just, regenerative, and locally self-reliant economy. Each of those words is important, and we might come back to them, but you'll see them show up in the hypotheses. And all that's bounded by a vision of a world that works for all life, where human needs are met in ways that benefit all life, where every person on earth has adequate access to basic needs and opportunities. And we kind of can envision thriving ecosystems increasing in biodiversity and abundance for a reliably prosperous future for all life for all time. And those words also, there's a lot to say about each of those, but I do want to put that as the backdrop for, okay, well, how does that inform what Lyft does in terms of its strategies and like its approach to this transformation of the economy? And so some of the hypotheses that we currently are working with, hypothesis number one is that there needs to be more Next Economy showcase examples. So there's a need for more examples that demonstrate what's possible for Next Economy activity or institutions.
And these are hypotheses that are needed in order to achieve the vision.
That's right, to achieve that transformation. Yeah, to effectuate or accomplish that transformation. A second hypothesis is that there's a skills gap or a learning gap or a sense-making gap, a knowledge gap, where there's training and skills that are scarce at the moment to help effectuate that change. There's a third hypothesis that there's a media gap. So within the training and skills, there's actually an information gap in the media about how information and inspiration about the next economy. Fourth hypothesis is that using the language of the two loops model, that hospice work is wholly inadequate for the transformation and essential to the transformation. So in other frames that we just talked about, like triage and transition work or Horizon 1, Horizon 2 type thinking or work is essential but wholly inadequate to the transformation of the economy.
Hospice meaning harm reduction.
Harm reduction, less badism, incremental change. Yeah. Hypothesis number 5, the way we word it today, is that there's a non-extractive funding gap. generally that there's resources that could be used to help effectuate the transformation of the economy. And there's currently a gap in accessibility or availability of those types of resources. Sixth hypothesis is that we call it the alternative personal security infrastructure gap. Looking forward to talking about that one. And then hypothesis number 7 is that there's some additional research and analysis, sense making that's missing. And so those are the current 7 hypotheses that the Lift Economy team has deliberated and developed and articulated over a number of years now. And we continue to evolve them. But all of the strategies that we use as a worker-owned impact consultancy are tied to those hypotheses, to addressing some of the gaps and needs that those hypotheses attempt to articulate. And collectively, our quote unquote theory of change is that by addressing those hypothetical needs, if those are met, if those needs are met, that will at the very least help effectuate the transformation of the economy to one that works for the benefit of all life with no one left out.
And this is separate from Next Economy MBA book. And in our course, we talk about problems of the next economy with things like interest-bearing debt and things like that. Mm-hmm. So those are probably a whole nother series of things we can go into on one of these.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a full part of any theory of change, I think, is some type of shared analysis of what's fundamentally not working or maladaptive about the design, the structures and culture and norms of a system, say the global economy, the global business as usual economy. There's an analysis there about like, why is it not working? Which takes a lot of different forms of analysis, a critique of the progress narrative, a critique of meritocracy, a understanding of the growth imperative that results as a effect of the way currency is typically created. There's a lot of aspects to that analysis of like, how did we get into this mess that the hypotheses for Lift Economies work for our theory of change as a small impact consultancy. The backdrop is that there's this like analysis. And so we could talk a little bit about the analysis as we go, but I think you're right. There's a whole almost historical perspective on the origins of racialized capitalism and how the business as usual economy has emerged and subsumed a lot of the other critical aspects of culture, the media system, the education system, the health system, the government system. So there's a lot to say about all of that, but you're right. That's maybe another great conversation to have.
Yeah. Well, why don't we jump in with a brief but critical analysis of hypothesis 1, more Next Economy showcase examples needed.
Great. And so again, any listener listening to this like theory of change discussion, if you're like Ryan and I nerding out on kind of like thinking about how to transition the economy, I'm curious for your feedback, if you disagree with this especially. At Lyft, we kind of see that one of the barriers for more people to commit their time, energy, and resources to transforming the economy is the need for there to be more examples or showcase examples that exist and are thriving in the way in which they are meeting human needs reliably and contributing to the regeneration, repair, restoration of society and the environment around them. And by examples in this case, a lot of it we're talking about is institutions, different types of institutions. So organizations that embody a more just, regenerative economy. The ones that we know of, and the good news is this is not science fiction. It's not just some exercise in imagination. They do exist today. It's just that many of them are small. They're physically disparate. They're operating in different parts of the world. They're unknown largely, or at least culturally marginalized. And many of them are like incomplete or lacking wholeness, meaning they're leaving them open to easy critique because they've figured out this piece or that piece or a few of these pieces together, but they don't have a couple of other pieces fully figured out. And so there's some kind of bias where if it's not whole unto itself as perfect, then it's not worthy of bringing our attention to because it's incomplete. And so when you think about Lift Economy in terms of our consulting services or what we do as an organization, we try to support the existing but oftentimes fractured or nascent efforts with technical assistance. And that can include support in finding resources or funding. And sometimes we work with emerging organizations and efforts that are starting from more of a blank slate and developing their own theory of change. And so we also provide technical assistance and resourcing to those types of organizations. So the hypothesis is that we need more showcase examples of things that are working to really just expand the imagination, the collective imagination, and to reaffirm commitment of like, yes, I should, as a foundation, dedicate my funding to these types of projects because there's evidence that they exist and they make significant, impactful change, and they're prefigurative of a larger movement if they can connect and federate and network with each other. Or any human being who's like, what should I do with my life energy? Should I just take care of myself and my family's needs immediately, or can I commit myself to the transformation of the economy at large and take care of myself and my family's needs? The more that there's examples of things that exist, the more whole they are, the more robust they are, the easier it will be for people to commit. And so maybe I'll...
What's like an example that has some pieces of this next economy, but there's still some flaws? And then maybe, is there one that's more of a complete vision that you, not complete, that'd be almost impossible, but more fully fleshed out?
I mean, I can give a couple of examples, but I'll start with one that we've probably talked about a lot in our Next Economy MBA. And I'll be careful to make sure I'm not revealing anything confidential about the pieces that might be incomplete. So I want to be just judicious about that. But we talk about, and it will seem so small for somebody thinking about the transfer, all this language of like transformation of the global business as usual economy. When I give this example, you'd be like, what? That seems so small and inconsequential. So hopefully I'll be able to tie it back around. But outside of Portland, Oregon, there's a town called Sherwood, just south and a little bit west of Portland. And there's a 65-acre farm there called Our Table. And on the one hand, if you went to the farm, you'd be like, oh, this is, there's some aspects that seem different, but it's, a 65-acre farm. And if you started to look at their practices, you might be like, okay, well, they're doing no-till, organic, mixed vegetable kind of production and some perennials, especially different types of blueberries. And they're doing either perennial or no-till. They've done some rewilding with beaver reintroduction. And there's basically a healthy, vibrant kind of soil health practices, so forth. But if you dug a little bit deeper from how the institution is structured, you find, okay, well, it's actually one of only a few dozen farms in the entire country that is actually owned by the workers. Meaning, like, if anybody listening to this knows anything about agricultural work, the population of agricultural workers in the United States and around the country are a highly marginalized and vulnerable population. And you might even say exploited pretty heavily. And so to have an institution that is owned by the farmers themselves is rare, not unique. But Our Table is not just owned by the farmers. It's actually a multi-stakeholder, cooperatively owned entity, so that there's a group of owners that is actually the other farms and ranches and in the nearby Willamette area that have come together as a group. So there's a part ownership by other farms and ranches. And then there's a third group that is actually the consumers in Sherwood, Oregon. So there's people who get their food from the farm who are consumers who are also owners. And so the governance, the decision making of what practices should we use, how much should the food cost, How much should the workers be paid? Really consequential decisions for the operation of agricultural activity. Should we go get this agrivoltaics, solar photovoltaic facility on the farm, near the perennials, and what are the outcomes of that? And should we apply for this grant? Should we go into debt to build out this area for people to gather? Those are questions that instead of one person or one family or a board made up of shareholders or investors making those decisions, those types of decisions are through dialogue and deliberation and some type of voting governance are decided by these different stakeholder groups. There also are limited investor groups that are another kind of stakeholder in the organization who have different kind of governance rights. And so there's a thoughtful construction to our table as an entity. And from an outcomes perspective, you have a robust showcase of great farming practices for soil health, carbon sequestration, biodiversity enhancement, all the things that we might want to see from a kind of farming operation that's providing nutritious vegetables and fruit to their local community. We see within the structure of the farm, there's actually a partial vertical integration where there's kind of a commercial kitchen facility to maybe capture potential food waste and upcycle it into prepared meals. And there's a storage on site for preserving the yield. There's a small marketplace. So this partial vertical integration where think of like a little grocery store that not only has the produce from the farm, but also I mentioned there's the other owners of the farm. One of the stakeholder groups is a group of other farmers and ranchers in the region, and they also have their goods and wares at this small kind of grocery. And so the decision to vertically integrate and create gathering spaces and dinners and kind of community cohesion around food, a culture around local food participation, that's again like prefigurative of, or it's a different type of food system if it was organized around nutrition and access and affordability and better practices that serve life. And so I won't go deeply into the things that are missing or flawed about our table or are soon to come, but we could talk more about that. But maybe I'll just use that as an example of like a showcase project. And for anybody who's listening to this and they're like, but Kevin, that's one 65-acre farm, even if it's got a cool multi-stakeholder governance and ownership structure for how the economic benefits flow within the community, that doesn't change the food system, much less change the economy. I would just invite you to expand your imagination for a moment because our table exists once. Now, just imagine if it existed 10,000, let's expand our imagination a little bit, 100,000 times. And most communities in North America or other parts of the world had an Our Table type institution where you, as a consumer of nutrient-dense vegetables and fruit or local perishable food, had a place where you were an owner able to be in dialogue and deliberation with the farmers who are producing the food through this kind of community social gathering spaces around health and nutrition and biodiversity and carbon capture and like a celebration of food. And then imagine if those 100,000 institutions became federated and shared some decision-making or financing or power. That you could imagine for a moment would be actually make a dent in terms of transforming a core aspect of a food system that the way it's currently structured under business as usual exploitation economy kind of norms is creating a very not well or ill population that is socially isolated and suffering from poor nutrition. And so there's a stacked function of addressing multiple aspects. And so it really requires us to expand our imagination because there's one or a couple, there's a few other farms they could talk about that have other elements like it. And so our hypothesis, going back to the hypothesis, is more showcase examples of next economy institutions helps us embrace the expansion of our imagination to say, I want that in my neighborhood. I want to participate in this in some way as an owner, as an entrepreneur, as a farmer, or a consumer. I want to be involved in the development of a different food system because it's possible. And as long as those examples don't exist, as long as they're scarce or marginalized, or then it becomes more of a science fiction exercise to engage people rather than something that they could maybe visit or walk to, drive to, bike to, or participate in more imminently.
Seems like a good hypothesis. But unfortunately, we probably have to wrap here. And I think there's a lot more to get into. I think we should probably do a few more showcase examples on the next one, drop into our next couple hypotheses. But I'm excited to see where this goes because I think it's useful and probably inspiring, hopefully inspiring for folks.
I hope so too.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. That's it for today. But Kevin and I will be back to continue the discussion. So you can reach out to the Lyft team at info@lyfteconomy.com and send us a note, how you liked it, what you'd like us to cover, and we'll get back to you. All right, thanks.
Thanks all.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lyfteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. I'm Anayana White, a Lyft Economy Next Economy MBA alum and the head of communications at the American Sustainable Business Network, ASBN. ASBN is on a mission to connect and mobilize sustainable business leaders for a just and regenerative economy and has launched a nationwide Tell Your Story campaign. Legislators and media are reaching out to ASBN for the stories and insights into how businesses are being affected by the current administration's policies. Do you have a story to tell? Use our guiding questions to craft and tell your story today at bit.ly/ASBN Tell Your Story. And find out more about our areas of impact and membership at asbnetwork.org.